Thanks for joining us this morning for this special online program hosted by the Merowith Center. My name is Laura Bryant. Our guide today is Elana Kaplan, former St. Louisan, and an independent museum educator and lecturer. She was an educator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art for 25 years and currently leads private tours at the Met and other museums, as well as virtual tours for groups around the globe. Today, Elana is going to help the Merowith Center kick off the holiday season by highlighting Greek and Roman art and how it connects to Hanukkah. Next month, she'll be back for Winter at the Met. And then, just in time for President's Day in February, she'll present another look at the ever-evolving American wing at the Met. So please help me welcome Elana Kaplan. We're always so happy to see you, Elana.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you always for all your hard work and putting all the wonderful programming together. And it's wonderful to be back. So we're going to get started because we have a lot to do. And I want to make sure to leave time for questions. Okay. Okay, so our topic today is the Hanukkah story through Greek and Roman art. And we are mostly going to focus on the Metropolitan Museum of Art, their collection, but we are going to travel around the world a little bit today also to look at some other Greek and Roman art. And at the end, I also included some stuff from the St. Louis Art Museum because I always like to include things from museums of the groups that I'm working with. So first, we're actually going to start off with a little bit of a historical background to the Hanukkah story. Because to really understand the story, we have to understand the history and geography of the Greek Empire. We also want to understand the culture of the Greek people and what the threat of Hellenism or the threat of Greek culture was for the Jewish people. So we're actually going to start about 150 years before the Hanukkah story at the time period of Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great was a fascinating figure that could be, a whole Zoom talk in itself. But we're just going to touch briefly on Alexander the Great. He became king in 336 BCE, before the Common Era. That's how I'll refer to the dates, before the Common Era. And he became king at the age of 20 years old. By 30, he had created one of the largest empires in history. And I'm going to show you a map so you can really visualize and understand his large empire. And you can see it's actually Alexander the Great's empire, you can see, is in the peach color. And you can see that it stretches all the way from Greece to India. So you see that the Greek Empire was a large landmass, which included parts of Europe, Asia Minor, parts of Egypt, parts of North Africa. And again, it went all the way to India. So Alexander the Great was undefeated in battle. He is widely considered to be one of history's greatest and most successful military commanders. He brought an end to Persian rule, and he also conquered the land of Israel, which you could see right over here. You see Jerusalem right over here. And as we're talking about Alexander the Great, we'll look at this bust of Alexander the Great, which is actually in the Israel Museum. And as I said, Alexander the Great ruled from 336 to 323 BCE. He actually he died when he was 32 years old after ruling for about 13 years. And if we're looking at this bust was actually made about 150 years after he died. And it's in the collection of the Israel Museum. So we have a lot of information in the Talmud, actually, about the relationship with Alexander the Great and the Jews at the time. And according to that, he was good to the Jews. He allowed them autonomy. He spared the temple from destruction. And he really allowed the Jews to have religious freedom and freedom of worship. He allowed them to rule their own country as long as they paid him taxes and they were made loyal. So the Jews are very thankful to Alexander the Great. And in fact, many Jewish people named their sons after him. So if you know someone named Alexander, it's very possible that it went all the way back to Alexander the Great. We'll look at another image of Alexander the Great. This is actually a coin in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art from around the time period. It's about the time period when Alexander the Great died, from 323 about BCE. And anyway, this is in the collection of the Met. And you can see the face of Alexander the Great. This is actually a coin that was minted immediately after his death. Again, he was quite a emperor, so they had all these coins minted after he died, and showing, of course, also his strength with the riding on the chariot here. Okay, so as I said, Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE. He was 32 years old. He ruled for about 13 years. And again, 13 years at such a young age, and he really conquered a large amount of land. After he died, his generals, he had about 11 generals, and of course, they fought and carved up his empire. The three main generals that fought for supremacy and are the most relevant to our story today are the ones that divided the Middle East amongst themselves. So those three rulers were Ptolemy, who secured Alexandria and Egypt. We can see this here. By the way, as you're looking at the map, notice how many cities in different areas are named Alexandria, all after Alexander. Most areas had a city named Alexandria after Alexander. So Ptolemy secured Alexandria in Egypt, and also the lands of Israel over here. That was one general. Seleucus took Syria and Asia Minor, and Antigonus, who took Greece. So those are the three generals that were in this Middle East area that were fighting over the lands here. So the Ptolemaic kingdom was based in Egypt. The Seleucid Egypt kingdom was based in Syria. And you can see, by the way, the importance of Jerusalem in those days and in general, because it's really the bridge between three continents. And that's why it was such a pivotal piece of land back then. And it was land that the Seleucids and the Ptolemaic Greeks, right? Because the Ptolemaic Greeks were here, the Seleucids were over here, and they fought over this land. They fought over the land of the area of Jerusalem for 125 years. The Seleucids finally won in 198 BCE, and the ruler was named Antiochus III. He defeated the Egyptians and he incorporated Judea into his empire. Now, by the way, there are 13 rulers named Antiochus or Antiochus. We're going to focus just on two of them. So Antiochus III, who finally beat the Ptolemy Empire. And he initially allowed, also like Alexander, he allowed the Jews to have autonomy. But after a stinging defeat at the hands of the Romans, he began a program of Hellenization. He wanted to force the Jews to abandon their monotheism for paganism. So that was a big, big threat at this time, that the Jews believed in one guide. And of course, the Greeks believed in many guides. We'll talk about that more when we look at all the amphora and all the different vases and different things. And we talk about also Greek mythology, right? So we know that the Greeks had many, many gods. And that was a very important part of the religion. So they found that the Jewish belief in one God to be very threatening. But Antiochus III backed down in the face of Jewish opposition to his efforts to introduce idols into their temple. And so he backed down. But his son, Antiochus IV, who we actually have this bust of, his son inherited the throne in 176 BCE. And we can see in this bust, this is actually in a museum in Berlin. And just looking at it, you can see that he looks like a very mean ruler, which he was. He inherited the throne in 176 BCE. He ruled until 164 BCE. And during that time, he resumed his father's original policy, and he took away freedom of religion from the Jewish people. He outlawed the Sabbath. He outlawed circumcision, which we're going to talk about. That's very, you'll see when we're looking at the art and also the story, why that was so threatening to Antiochus. He also defiled the temple he put an altar to the god Zeus in the Jewish temple. And he allowed also the sacrifice of pigs and other animals that was against the Jewish religion. So again, this was really limiting. It was limiting, obviously, freedom of religion. And so this led to a Jewish rebellion by Matityahu and his 5 sons. They were actually from the priestly tribe. So, of course, they were very much outraged at the introduction of idols into the temple. So they rebelled in 167 BCE, and through their will and strength and determination and their guerrilla warfare tactics, which we're going to talk about when we look at Greek armor, through all those things, were able to defeat the powerful Greek army. And that's one of the things that we talk about on Hanukkah. We talk about the miracle of the light, which is that the oil lasted for 8 days, but also that the small kind of ragtag army of the Maccabees were able to defeat the large, powerful Greek army. So then in the rebellion of the Maccabees began in 167 BCE. In 164 BCE, they recaptured Jerusalem. They recaptured the temple. They purified the temple. And they only found a little bit of pure olive oil. It should have only lasted one night. It ended up lasting 8 days until they could make new olive oil, which took a long time. And all of this information, all the history that I've just been talking about is actually in a book called The Book of the Maccabees. So we can see that the story of Hanukkah is really a fight for religious freedom, which we were talking about. This story happened in 167 BCE and still something, unfortunately, that happens today, which is fighting for religious freedom and freedom of worship. Okay, so now we understand the history and geography and the backdrop to the Hanukkah story, but now we really have to explore and understand what was Greek culture and why was that so different than Judaism? Why was the threat of Hellenization? Why was it such a threat to the Jewish religion? And we're going to do that through exploring Greek art and architecture today. Because really, in order to understand Greek culture, we have to look at Greek art and architecture. So, as I said, today we're going to travel around the world a little bit, and we're going to start in Athens. And we're going to be traveling to some places that I'm sure some of you have been to, and looking at them together. So here we are in Athens, and we're looking now at a picture of Athens. Athens, of course, is a city that was named after Athena, the Greek goddess. She was the goddess of warfare, the goddess of wisdom, the goddess of the arts, and many other things. And again, as we're talking about different gods and goddesses and looking at the sculptures, remember that was a strong belief in ancient Greece, the idea of many gods, that they controlled the world, their origin stories, sculptures of all these gods, and that was a completely different than the Jewish belief in one God. So as long as everyone kept their beliefs is fine. But when the Greeks started to impose their beliefs and didn't allow for freedom of religion, that's where it got dangerous. So here we're looking at the Acropolis of Athens, and that was an ancient citadel located on a rocky outcrop above the city of Athens. It's built on the highest point of the city. And the most important place on the Acropolis is the Parthenon, which we can see right here. Now, while you're looking at the Parthenon, notice the architecture. This is really representative of Greek architecture, and we're going to come back to this. So the Parthenon was a resplendent marble temple. It was built between 447 and 443 BCE. So about 100 years before Alexander the Great. And it was dedicated to Athena. The Parthenon was dedicated to Athena, the guardian goddess of Athens. And what was it used for? It was used for processions for the Panathenaic Games. We're going to talk about the Panathenaic Games in a little bit when we're looking at some of the art. That was a precursor to the Olympics. So the Panathenaic Games began here. There would also be theater here. And this is really where Greek culture emanates from. This is really the source of Greek culture. Now, as we're talking about Greek culture and Hellenism, something really to keep in mind is there's a lot in common philosophically between Hellenism and Judaism, between ancient Greek culture and Judaism. So they both had a focus on wisdom, philosophy, and deep discussions. And this is very important to understand the Hanukkah story, because sometimes the cultures that are most threatening are the ones that are very similar. And again, the Greek culture was very similar to Judaism. Their wisdom, focus on deep discussions, philosophy. So it was very, enticing to many people. And so as I said, we're going to focus on some of the differences. Like I said, the difference between polytheism and monotheism and other things. But there were a lot of similarities, and those similarities were what was more interesting and maybe kind of seductive to some of the Jewish people. Okay, so by the way, why is it called Hellenism? So when the Greeks conquered Israel, starting with Alexander the Great, they brought their culture with them. Anywhere they went, Whenever Alexander the Great would conquer lands, he would bring Greek culture with it. So why is it called Hellenism? Because the Greeks called their land Hellas, and they call themselves the Hellenes. So their culture was Hellenism. It was actually the Romans who later called them the Greeks. We still call them Greeks today, but that's not what they call themselves. The Romans call them the Greeks, and that's the name that stuck. So even though we call them the Greeks, we call their culture Hellenism. So again, whatever country the Greeks conquered, and again on that map, we saw that they conquered a lot of places, they would enforce their military prowess and their culture onto the people that they conquered. So their literature, their art, their philosophy, their architecture, and also their principles of physicality. And all of these things we're going to talk about as we look at the art. So we'll keep that all in mind. Now, the Greeks also looked at the human body as perfection. And that's why any of you have been to the Met or any other museums that have a large collection of Greek art, you'll notice that a lot of the sculptures are nude sculptures because they looked at the body as perfection. And because of that, that's why they found the idea of circumcision, that the Jews circumcised their sons. They found that very threatening because they thought of circumcision as body mutilation. Because again, they saw the human body as perfection. So now you see a number of ideas where there was really a culture clash between polytheism and monotheism, between leaving the human body and kind of almost worshiping the human body and circumcision. So we see some of the opposing beliefs. And again, if everyone allowed each person to worship as they wanted, freedom of worship, it would have been fine. But when they were starting to impose and forcing their religion and their ideas, that's when the Maccabees had revolted. Okay. So now we're going to so we were looking here at the Parthenon. Now what we're going to do is we're going to travel a little, as I said. And we are going to travel to our first museum is actually the Acropolis Museum. And this is a museum in Athens. Some of you might have been here before. This museum actually has a lot of the artifacts that were originally on or around the Parthenon. But in order to preserve and protect them, right, because we just saw the Parthenon outside, in order to preserve and protect all of the artifacts, they were brought indoors. And many of them were brought to the Acropolis Museum. And some of them are also in the British Museum, which we'll talk about because that is a subject of a lot of controversy. But the Acropolis Museum is one of the world's best archaeological museums, and we'll go around it all so you can see it. And what's amazing is the Acropolis Museum is focused on the findings of just one archaeological site. Everything in this museum is from the Acropolis of Athens, as opposed to if you think about, the British Museum or the Met, where we have, artifacts from many archaeological sites. This museum is just from one archaeological site, the Acropolis. Now, it's really an amazing architectural museum. You can see it's has surrounded by all these glass panes. And what's interesting about that is because it really connects the modern city. You can look out of the window and see kind of the modern city, modern Athens, with ancient parts of the city. And that makes it really an evocative experience to be able to look out and see modern Athens and ancient Athens at the same time. Now, what do we see in this museum? So you see a lot of sculptures, and some of the things we were talking about before. You'll notice that many of the sculptures are either in the nude or partially in the nude, again, to show the beauty, the perfection of the human body, to show a lot of the people, by the way, are, this is not exactly how they would look, but it's definitely enhanced. You can see some of the sculptures. By the way, the bottom of the virtual tour just shows other rooms and other images, so you get an idea of some of the things that I'm talking about. But the other thing, besides all these sculptures that you can see, is around the wall, you probably see a frieze, okay, which goes all the way around the wall. If we go down the hall here, you'll see it over here also on the wall. Okay. And this is the Parthenon frieze at the Acropolis Museum. So the Parthenon frieze is known as, has a number of different names. I'm just going to get a little farther away because I think I'm a little too close to it. Okay. It has a number of names to it. It's also referred to as the Parthenon marbles, or marble. It's made out of marble, and also the Elgin marbles, which is a name you might have heard before, and we'll talk about that. But anyway, just to focus on what they are, what this frieze is, it's a collection of classical Greek marble sculptures, which are original parts of the Parthenon and also original parts of other sacred and ceremonial structures built on the Acropolis of Athens. They were made around the 5th century BCE. And as I said, part of the collection is here and part is in the British Museum, which we will travel to also. But what are we looking at here? What is the subject of the Parthenon frieze? And really, it's a couple things. It shows us the birth of the goddess Athena, which of course she was the patron goddess of the city of Athens. And it also shows a battle between Athena and the god Poseidon to determine who would be the patron deity of Athens. So you can see over here, there are different battle scenes, right? You can see the horses, you can see people. And in some of the other ones that we were looking at, you saw different gods and goddesses and the goddess Athena. So it's very, very detailed. I mean, just in terms of the artistry, it's just incredible. All these things carved out of stone, a lot of them carved out of marble, the details in them, and we'll have a chance to see that when we get closer up to some of the artwork. But here you can see some of the figures, some of the fighting, some of the weapons, very detailed. So this is where about half of the Parthenon frieze is. And the rest is the next place that we're going to travel to, which is in the British Museum. So here we are. It's amazing how we can travel so quickly from museum to museum. Here we are in the British Museum, and you can see on this label here in the middle of the room, it says the sculptures of the Parthenon. Okay, so about half of the surviving sculptures from the Parthenon are in the British Museum. And in fact, it's interesting. I think you could see them much clearer in the British Museum, maybe the quality of the virtual tour, but also maybe because all the windows in the Acropolis Museum, the lighting wasn't as good. But I'm going to show you just the size of this room that has the Parthenon frieze. And it's a huge room. And it's actually called the Acropolis Galleries, very unique to the British Museum. These galleries were designed to contain the Parthenon sculptures, and they're the size of the Parthenon in the Acropolis. This room is the size of the Parthenon in the Acropolis. So it really was created, specifically for the friezes from the Parthenon. And the British Museum was part of the excavation also of the Parthenon as well. So this has scenes from the interior of the Parthenon and also scenes from the top of it. And most of these are actually mythological scenes. Again, we'll try and get a little bit closer just so you can see. And the details are just incredible. I mean, look at the horses and the people. And again, the similar story to what we were talking about before, the battle between Athena and Poseidon. There's a lot of battle. There's a lot of Greek gods and goddesses. And again, also the focus on battle is going to be important to our story. Also, here we go over here. So very, very detailed. You can spend a lot of time looking at these. But just to give a little history, because I touched on this, anyone who's following the art news in recent years, of course, there's a lot about the argument of the Parthenon frieze or the Elgin marbles. And the background to it really is that between 1808 and 1812, that's when the Ottoman Empire was controlling Greece. And there was a man named Lord Elgin, that's why they're called the Elgin marbles. And he was the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire at the time. And he spent a lot of time, obviously, he was the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And he had about a number of the sculptures from the Parthenon sent to Britain. He sold them to the British government, and then they ended up going to the British Museum. Now, he claims that he had the permission of the Ottoman Empire, so it was all done totally legally. But the Greek government has been disputing that for many, many years. This is really it's a long-standing international controversy. And of course, looking at this room, you can very much understand why. I mean, it's an amazing cultural treasure. You can see the British Museum has half of them. If you look around this room, you can see how much they have. And the argument basically is, to kind of boil it down very simply, the Greeks believe that Lord Elgin stole the Elgin marbles. He said he took them illegally. It was unethical, and they say that it's really an exceptional cultural of exceptional cultural importance to Greece, and they should be reunited with the other Parthenon frieze that is in the Acropolis Museum. So that's their argument, and the British government and the British Museum argue that Lord Elgin got them legally from the Ottoman Empire, who was in charge then, and he purchased them legally. And they also say that if they return them, it'll set a precedent which could undermine the collections of museums around the world if they have to start returning things. And they also say that the British Museum was allowing them to be viewed in the context of other major cultures, whereas in the Acropolis Museum, it's just about Greek art and Greek culture. So those are the arguments. It's in the news all the time. If you Google it, this has been going on for years, and I think it's going to be going on for a long time. As you can see, this room was created just for this for the Parthenon frieze, and it's it is an ongoing, long-standing controversy. Okay, so now we really understand a little bit about Greek art, about Greek culture, and the focus on a lot of the frieze that we're looking at is really on the focus on war, which relates to the Chanukah story, and the focus of gods and goddesses and the battle between gods and goddesses and the idea of polytheism, which was the Greek belief as opposed to monotheism, which the Jews believed in. Okay, so now talking about Hellenism, it's not only important because of its impact on the Jews, it also basically formed the West in many ways. So we today in the West are very much influenced by Greek culture, Greek art, and Greek architecture. And before we travel any further, in a virtual tour, we're actually going to talk a little bit about Greek architecture. So this was the picture of the Parthenon. Remember, take a look at it. And remember, as I said, that really influenced architecture throughout the West. And as I'm talking about it, think about buildings that you're familiar with around the world and in your city also that have been influenced by the architecture of the Parthenon and the architecture of ancient Greece. So we'll start with a few well-known buildings. We were just inside this building. We were just in the British Museum. Now we're outside. Look at the entrance to the British Museum. Again, the columns, right, that we saw in the Parthenon. You're going to see these columns. And this is, Greek architecture, the influence of Greek architecture on the West. Also, look at the figures up here. Greek figures, Greek-style figures. This is actually a whole story. It's showing the what they call the progress of civilization through Greek figures. And this is at the top of the British Museum. Many other museums have this kind of architecture and other buildings as well. Some of you might recognize this building. It's in New York. It's the General James A. Farley Post Office, which occupies 2 city blocks on 8th Avenue. And it has the largest giant order Corinthian colonnade in the world. Again, influence from the Parthenon. So you really see how Greek culture, Greek architecture, it has really influenced the West. We have in Virginia, the Rotunda. We have the Jefferson Memorial. And I always like to connect our talk to, the cities that I'm zooming to. And here we have the St. Louis Art Museum, right? Again, the columns, all influenced by ancient Greek architecture and culture. And of course, the museum that we're going to be traveling to today, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, also very much influenced by Greek architecture that we can see here. So that's just one way that we're looking at that Greek culture really impacted the world and impacted the West. All of this architecture was based on the Parthenon. And we'll see other ways today, also other ideas that still very much part of Western culture that were influenced by the ancient Greeks. So before we go into the Met and look at some of the objects together, we're actually going to go to a museum in Greece. This museum is called the Museum of Olive and Greek Olive Oil. Olive oil was one of the most important exports of Greece for thousands of years until today. And we're going to talk about why olive oil was so important in ancient Greeks. The Greeks used a lot of olive oil. And actually, this tour has a mind of its own. It's a 360 tour that kind of goes around. But let's just look at some of these. I was saying that the Greeks used a lot of olive oil, and we can see here these flasks that stored olive oil. We can also see an ancient olive press over here. And olive oil is very much related to ancient Greek culture, as we'll talk about. And it's also very much related to the Chanukah story, right? As I said at the beginning, there was the Chanukah has talked about the miracle of the light, that they only found a little bit of olive oil to light the temple menorah, but it was a miracle that it lasted for 8 days until they could make more olive oil. So how is olive oil related to ancient Greek culture? And in order to understand that, this is a really interesting museum to go through, like all about olives and olive harvest and olive oil and the importance of olive oil. But we're really going to go to this part over here. You can actually see in the museum, they have like a thing of olive oil over here. And then don't worry if you can't read or see it that clearly, because we're going to look at these objects close up. I just want you to get an idea of what this museum looks like. So if you look on the wall here, you might notice that there are there's a lot of writing, and they're pictures of ancient Greek vases or amphora. Amphora is the way to describe the shape of an ancient vase. And there are lights over here. You can see these hanging lights, right? Because they used olive oil for lighting. We're going to talk about all the things they used olive oil. And then in this case over here, you can see all the different vases and amphora and different size ones on the wall here. And there's one original in this case. Again, don't worry if you can't see it so clearly, because we'll see more of these in the Met, but you'll see something similar to this in the Met. This is a prize amphora, and you might be able to see there's some people running on it. And again, I just wanted to see that we have these objects in museums around the world, including this Museum of Olive and Olive Oil, but we'll look at these objects much closer up in the Met, because the Met has a huge collection. This museum has a couple, but the Met has a huge collection of them. So we're going to travel now in order to understand these ancient Greek amphora, we're going to travel back to the Met. Here we are back at the Met, and we're going to now focus on the Met's, some of the Met's ancient Greek objects, again, in order to connect them to the Chanukah story. So we'll start off here. You saw something similar to this in the Museum of Olive and Olive Oil, but let's talk a little bit about this. This is called a prize amphora. And again, an amphora is an ancient Greek container or vase with a large oval body, the shape of it, and a narrow cylindrical neck. Okay, so that's what an amphora is, and we're going to be looking at a lot of them today. So take a minute, look at these. These are amazing, these objects. This one is actually from about 550 to 560 BCE. This is one of the earliest amphora in the Met's collection. And all of these amphora that we're going to be looking at, they are actually called terracotta Panathenaic prize amphora. So these objects were from the Panathenaic Games, which we actually talked about way at the beginning when I was talking about the Parthenon, and I was saying that's where the Panathenaic Games were. Just a little background about the Panathenaic Games. They were held every 4 years in Athens in ancient Greece from 566 BCE, which was around the time period of this amphora. And they were held from 566 BCE to the 3rd century CE. And again, they are the precursor to the modern day Olympics. So these games, the Panathenaic Games, incorporated religious festival ceremony, including prize giving, hint to what we're looking at. They also had athletic competitions and cultural events, all hosted within a stadium, often the Parthenon. And they were played across the cities of Greece. And they were so important to the ancient Greek culture that if there happened to be fighting or wars, and remember, there was a lot of fighting and wars, especially during Alexander the Great's time and his generals' time. But when there were fighting and wars, they would actually stop the wars or fighting during the games because they were so important. Why were the Panathenaic Games so important? They were a way to bring glory to your country, the glory of Greece, the glory of sports and music, the glory of competition. So this idea of competition really originated or was very strong in ancient Greece. And as we're talking about ideas from ancient Greece and Greek culture that still have an impact on the West today, and we talked about architecture, the idea of competition is still one. We're going to talk about how much competition there was through these objects, but if you think about how it affects the West today, if you think about how much we today invest in winning and winning games, right? Anyone who has kids or grandchildren who play sports, the focus on winning. What about the Super Bowl, the World Series, all these things? There's a big focus on competition and winning, and that really came from the ancient Greece. Okay, so what are we looking at here? I said it's a prize amphora for the Panathenaic Games, and hopefully as I was talking, you were looking at the details. So what are we looking at here? We are looking at the prize for the competition that you see on the back of it, right? So this is the prize that would be given in this case to the winner of this race that we have here. On the front of all of these amphorae this is Athena, right? The goddess of the Panathenaic Games. And this would be the prize. So this alone to me is an amazing prize, but it wasn't just this, it actually would have been filled with, some of you might have guessed what it would be filled with because it's connected to our story and connected to a very important export from Greece. And that is, it would be filled with olive oil. So the winner of the competition depicted on this amphora would win this filled with olive oil. Now, olive oil was very expensive in ancient Greece. It was like liquid gold. So this was a very expensive prize. And again, we have a connection to olive oil from the story of the miracle of the olive oil and lasting 8 days. Now, what was so important about olive oil in ancient Greece? Well, we know from the story of Chanukah, it was used to light. It was used for to light things. We saw in the Museum of Olive and Olive Oil, we saw all those different like lanterns and light that you would put olive oil in. So that was a very important thing. But it was also used by athletes. And remember, athletics was very important in ancient Greece. Competition, athletics. If you were an athlete, it was a way to bring glory to your family, kind of like also if you were a fighter, if you were a warrior, and if you were an athlete, that was how you brought glory to your family. And what did athletes use olive oil for? They actually used it as also almost like a moisturizer. They would rub their bodies often before competing. And they did this for two reasons. First of all, they thought that it made them faster, but also it made their bodies slippery. And for some of the competitions like wrestling or like something that was called pancration, which we'll talk about later, that was a form of wrestling. If your body was slippery, that was hard for your opponent to grab you. So as we're looking at these, at this amphora, you might have also noticed that the runners are running in the nude. So athletes would perform in the nude. So if they had rubbed their bodies with olive oil, they would be really hard to grab. Again, looking at these objects, also you can see, again, related to the story of Chanukah, why this athletics and this performing in the nude was so threatening for Jewish people, because if you performed in the nude and someone had a circumcision, everybody would know, and they, you wouldn't be accepted. You wouldn't be seen as having, that perfect human body. Now, the other thing that was so important about olive oil, by the way, is that they believe that olive oil harnessed the power of Athena. Athena was the goddess of the Panathenaic Games. She was a patron goddess of Athens. So, olive oil, they believed, would harness her power. So it's very interesting to see that, and we're going to look at the Met has many, many of these Panathenaic prize amphora. So you can see how important they were, how prevalent they were, and how important olive oil was, both to sports and culture. By the way, olive oil is still, as I think I read this, that it's still the main export from Greece today. A lot of olive oil comes from Greece. I've seen a lot of oil from Italy, but apparently a lot of it comes from Greece. Okay, so the Met actually has a very large collection of these. We have rooms and rooms full of these vases and amphora and different, shaped vessels. A couple of cases from the Panathenaic Games, but we have rooms of them that show ancient Greek mythology, which we're going to talk about again. So it's really, these are just amazing objects. It's also amazing to think about, first of all, how they're made artistically, and the fact that we have so many of them left. I mean, they're made out of, as I said, out of, they're terracotta, they're made out of clay. very fragile. If you drop one of these, cracks, not like those, big marble sculptures from the Parthenon. These, if you drop it or something happens, they crack in a lot of pieces. So the fact that we have so many in amazing condition is quite wonderful and teaches us so much about the culture. So again, here we're looking at another one, another Panathenaic prize amphora. This is from about 530 BCE. And here we can see we have 5 runners here competing in a foot race, probably a sprint by the way they look. By the way, the foot race is one of the earliest known events in the Panathenaic Games. And we can see as we're looking at it, some of the things I pointed out already, you'll notice all these things already. We have Athena always on one side, the goddess of the games, as a warrior. We have the athletes who are performing in the nude. And by the way, this also offered Greek artists the opportunity to show the details and these artists that their craftsmanship have been able to carve, some of the sculptures we saw carve the human body out of marble, or showing details here in this terracotta amphora. And by the way, these would all, as I said, be filled with olive oil. Most of them were filled with about 42 quarts of olive oil. So that's a lot of liquid gold. Okay, and our next prize amphora is something. The last two were competitions that we still have in the Olympics today. This we don't have anymore, but this is showing us horse racing. This is one of the. I'm sorry, we have horse racing. We don't have chariot racing, which I'll show you soon. So this is a horse racing trophy, one of the oldest. And again, it would have been filled with Athenian olive oil, which, as I said, was a valuable commodity, as we said, for lighting, for cooking, for cleansing the body, and for harnessing the power of Athena. Our next one, you might notice, is quite different than the other ones that we've been looking at, right? Here we have all of these. This one is quite different. This is actually a later one. The last 3 were from the early 500s BCE. This is from 366 BCE. So this was made 150 years after the last few that we were looking at. This was from about 30 years before Alexander the Great. And the shape is different. It also has a lid. But again, it's Panathenaic prize amphora, also would have been filled with olive oil. And we also see Athena and the runners. So again, this idea of competition, the idea of athletes performing in the nude, all of these things we can see through the art here. Our next one is a competition we no longer have. I referred to it earlier. It's called pancration. This is from about 500 BCE. So again, we have Athena on one side, and we have these 2 men over here. By the way, the athletes were all male, as you've seen. And pancration is a combination of wrestling, boxing, and kicking. It was actually quite a dangerous sport, which is why we have this man over here. He is not competing, and that's why he's wearing something over him. He is a judge. And the fact that they included a judge highlights the danger of this event to the competitors, that you had to have a judge right there. So again, thinking about the olive oil and using it as a moisturizer, you can understand in this competition how the person who used it was really at an advantage, because it made his body very slippery and hard to catch. Okay, we're going to look at one more prize amphora here at the Met. Again, we have the goddess Athena, and here we have the chariot race, which we no longer have in competitions. But this one to me is so interesting because we have Athena's shield, which you noticed different shields have different symbols on them. This one has a symbol of the flying horse, which is really an appropriate motif here, because look, on the other side, we have the chariot race, and look how the artist is conveying the speed of the chariot by the position of the horses, who are almost seem to be flying over the ground. And that's connected here to this flying horse on Athena's shield. So the connection here. So again, the idea of competition, very important in ancient Greece. That's how you brought glory to your family. And you had to perform in the nude. So this was something that Jews were excluded from. And that meant that they were really very much excluded from Greek culture. Now, this is actually a very small object. Just to give you an idea, most of those prize amphora were about 24 inches high. Just to give you an idea, this object is very small. It's 6 5/8 inches long. It's called a bronze strigil. And I just wanted people to be able to see it, so I enlarged it a little bit. But as I said, in the ancient Greek world, olive oil was really used for basic skincare. So after you would put the olive oil on your body, they would use this object here. It's called a strigil, and they would scrape the surface of the skin clean. They would kind of scrape off not to have too much olive oil. And we actually have numerous representations on vases of athletes using a bronze strigil after exercising, before exercising, so we know exactly how these objects were used. So we're going from a very small object in the Met to a very big object in the Met. This is made out of marble. It's 10 feet tall. It's from about 530 BCE, and it's a marble stele, a grave marker with a youth and a little girl. Now, this is a very well-preserved object. It's the most complete grave monument of its type to have survived from this time period. It actually has an inscription on the base, and it says, "To dear Megacles on his death, his father and his dear mother set this up as a monument." So we assume that this young man's name was Megacles, and they made this very elaborate grave monument for him when he died. And he's shown as an athlete. Look at how he's shown on his grave monument, right? Athletic in the prime of his life. He's got, if you can see the detail around his wrist, is an oil flask suspended from his wrist. So again, the importance of olive oil to athletes, the importance of olive oil in ancient Greece. And as I said before, athletics were really an important part of Greek life. It was part of every boy's education, was athletics. And again, if you were an athlete or a warrior, you brought pride to your family and to Greece. And the olive oil they would carry around as a cleanser for both before exercising to make them faster and after exercise to clean them. He's also holding a pomegranate in his hands. That was a fruit which in ancient Greece was associated with both fertility and also death in ancient Greek mythology. So that's a symbol of his death, but it's also perhaps indicating that he had reached puberty before his death. And then we have a young girl who's there, probably his sister, and she's holding a flower. Now, this is a very lavish, tall monument, over 10 feet high. This is a very, very wealthy family to be able to erect this monument. And again, when you're looking at these sculptures and you're looking at, the different things of the athletes, you have to also understand that a lot of it was, he was certainly made to look more muscular and kind of embellished a little bit in these sculptures. But again, to show the importance of the beauty of the human body and the importance of athletics. And this is another case in the museum. So we saw a number of the amphorae from the Panathenaic Games, but as I said, we have rooms and rooms full of these different kinds of vases and jars and jugs with other stories on them. Some of them are depicting warfare, which was very important in ancient Greece, as we talked about before, with Alexander the Great and his generals and all the fighting that went over all the years. So Greek warfare was very important. And it's depicted not only on these vases, but also we'll look at, we have a lot of armor from ancient Greece. So, and what this case highlights with a lot of the warfare that we can see and with the armor is that warfare in Greece wasn't just done out of necessity, but fighting in ancient Greece was done, it was part of your honor, like athletics, fighting was part of your honor. And when you fought, you represented your family, you represented your country, you represented your status also. So based on your status, you had different types of armor. For example, if you owned land, you were allowed to have a horse. Otherwise, you were just a foot soldier. Okay. And again, that's very important. And we're going to connect this to the Chanukah story because, of course, there was the fight with the Maccabees against the Greek army. So the idea of the importance of army and fighting and bringing honor to your country was very relevant. So to understand the fight of the Maccabees, the few against the many and the weak against the strong, we have to understand ancient Greek warfare. So here we have a picture of ancient Greek warfare. And the Greeks had a special battle formation, which you can see a picture of it here, and the name was called phalanx. And this made them almost an unstoppable army, which is how, Alexander the Great was able to conquer so much of the Greek Empire, they were almost unstoppable. So what is a phalanx? In military science, it's actually a tactical formation. And you can see it here. It's consisting of a block of heavily armed infantry, and they're standing shoulder to shoulder, really close in files several ranks deep. And they marched in formation in unison, protecting each other with these long spears and keeping horses away. So when you look at this, and that was the power of the Greek army, you can see their spears, you can see their shields. When you look at this, and then you think of the Chanukah story, it's really remarkable that a ragtag army under Judah the Maccabee was able to be victorious between the years of 168 to 165 BCE. And again, remember, they were rebelling. They only fought against the Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV. They only started rebelling because they were not allowed to worship freely. They were not allowed freedom of worship. Remember, under Alexander the Great, they didn't rebel, and under Antiochus the third, they didn't rebel. But once there was religious oppression, that's when they started to rebel. Once there were decrees that forbade them to practice their Jewish religion. So interestingly, Judah the Maccabee, the head of this ragtag army, he knew the land of Israel very well. So he used that to his advantage, and he was able to break the Greek phalanx. How did he do that? He forced the Greek soldiers into very narrow areas in the hills of Samaria, in the lands of Israel, where if it was a narrow area, you can imagine looking at this picture, they had to break up their formation, they had to walk in single lines, and then the Maccabees attacked them from the sides and from the back. And that is really how they were able to do this. And again, it was really using guerrilla warfare in order to defeat the great Greek army, and they ended up defeating the strongest army in the world. And so eventually the Greeks made alliances with the Jews and gave them autonomy. There were about 8 battles altogether, and after the 4th, the Jews were able to purify the temple. That's when they found the light, they lit the menorah, and that's what Hanukkah, these are the 2 things Hanukkah is commemorating: the miracle of the oil and the miracle of the battle. Now, very interesting kind of modern point is that the Maccabees were the first in history to use guerrilla warfare. So there are actually many armies since then that study the Book of the Maccabees and study guerrilla warfare from Judah the Maccabee. If you go to West Point, there's actually a sculpture of Judah the Maccabee. And in West Point, they actually studied the Book of the Maccabees during the Vietnam War, because they kind of were comparing the Vietnamese rice farmers against the strong U.S. Army to the Maccabees against the strong Greek army. And apparently they studied the Book of the Maccabees to understand guerrilla warfare from that time period. Interesting side point, at West Point, they never studied the Six-Day War in Israel because they said there's no military way to explain that. It was just miraculous. But there were many, many armies that actually studied the Judah the Maccabee and Maccabee warfare. George Washington wrote down that he also, before different battles, he looked into that, and other modern generals as well. So I think that's so interesting. So talking about the army and fighting, we have to look at some ancient Greek armor. Here we're looking at a helmet and a pair of shin guards from the 5th century BCE. And this was part of what was called a panoply, which was a set of offensive and defensive arms that a Greek warrior would have used in combat. It also would have included a spear, a shield, and a sword, which we saw in that picture we saw before. Interesting, look at the details. It's interesting, the elliptical form of the eyes. By the way, this is made out of bronze. We can also see the cutouts for the ears, the decoration on the front of these serpents. And the shin guards are really notable for the expert modeling of the anatomical detail, right? And again, if we talk about how the Greeks were so focused on the beauty of the human body, look at some of their armor, right? Looks like the human body. This is bronze body armor from the 4th century BCE. Again, this is a major element of Greek warriors' panoply. And this shows how much body armor has in common with sculpture, right? With Greek sculpture, where we saw the details of the muscles. Here, it really shows a rendering of the male torso. And this one was actually made for a horseman, and it shows all the muscles of the chest and the back. Also, of course, these are all idealized to heroic proportions that we were talking about before. I just wanted to also say that besides the Panathenaic amphora and the ones depicting Greek warfare, we also have a lot about, this one is also about Greek warfare, but we also have a lot of these jars and jugs and oil flax showing ancient Greek mythology, right? And again, the idea of the ancient Greeks believed in many gods and goddesses, polytheism, which is also, again, fine when it was their belief, but when they imposed it on the Jews and forced them to, believe in all these gods and goddesses, that became a problem. So we have hundreds of vases and flasks and drinking vessels and all kinds of things showing ancient Greek mythology. And that was a way for the ancient Greeks to give over their culture, to tell their stories and reinforce their messages, the stories of their heritage, and also their origin stories. Because at that time period, at the high point of Greek civilization, fewer than a third of the adult population could read or write. So they couldn't write down their origin stories and their stories of their heritage that they wanted to pass on, because a lot of people couldn't read or write. So how did they pass on these stories? By creating them on their terracotta, on their pottery, on their vases, on their drinking vessels. And when they were used, they would pass these stories on throughout the generations. So it's amazing that we have so many of them left. Here's just one example. This is a terracotta. This one, each, depending on the size and shape of it, has a different name. So this is called a column crater, and this was a bowl used to mix wine and water. This is showing us different Greek gods and goddesses like Hephaestus, and this is actually showing us another origin story at Greek mythology. And this object would have been used at a Greek symposium. A Greek symposium was part of a banquet that would take place over a meal, and there was dancing and music. And what would happen here? This is where Greek culture really emanated from the symposium. People, they would tell Greek mythology, and there would be music. And there would be a lot of discussions and deep philosophical discussions at the symposium. And there are a lot of people who say that actually the Passover Seder is modeled on the Greek symposium. The focus on philosophy and talking and exploring, and also there's drinking, wine drinking, and singing. So anyway, this would have been used for mixing wine and water at a Greek symposium. But on all these objects was Greek mythology, Greek origin stories, so they could continue on the generations. And again, what's important to our story is how focused Greek culture was on polytheism and many gods and goddesses, and on warfare and on athletics, and all things that ended up being very threatening and to Judaism, and not forcing Jews to follow this religion and follow these ideals, which is what led to the warfare. Before I end, I know I want to leave time for questions, and we're just at an hour, but I didn't want to end without showing two objects from the St. Louis Art Museum that when I went into the collection, I found these two vases. And again, it connects to what we've been talking about. The first one over here is it's an amphora, and it has Heracles and Apollo. It also has, notice, Athena. We've seen a lot of Athena. So again, the focus on gods and goddesses. This one is from the same time period as some of the ones I was showing you, from 530 to 510 BCE. We didn't talk about the artistry. There's so much to talk about. We didn't talk about artistry, but just to point out, this is called a black figure vase because the figures are in black. And this is also from the St. Louis Art Museum, but to contrast, this is a red figure vase. And so that you can really see what that means, black figure vases versus red figure vases. We'll put them side by side. And this one's also showing Greek mythology. This is the goddess Nike and youth. And this is from 490 BCE. So really from looking at all of these objects, you can really understand the focus in Greek culture on warfare, the focus on mythology, the focus on competition and athletics. And again, when those were ancient Greek beliefs and they believed in it, but didn't impose their beliefs and force them on the countries they were conquering and on the Jewish people, it was fine for everyone to, follow their religion and find their culture. But when they were imposed and took away religious freedom, that is when, when there was religious tyranny, that is when the Maccabees rose up. So I know we celebrate Hanukkah at the end of the month, um, but I just wanted to quickly bring us to the Israel Museum, where this whole in Israel, where the story takes place. And in the Israel Museum, they have a vast collection of objects from this time period. They have a lot of coins. You can see it's the Hellenistic period. They have coins from the Hashmonaim. That was a family of the Maccabees. And we have all these ancient coins that have objects on them uh, um, from that time period, representation of different objects from that time period. And the Israel Museum has a lot of these coins. It's quite amazing. And they also have a great collection of menorahs. So I thought before I end, you can't really talk about the Hanukkah story without at least looking at some menorahs. The Israel Museum has an amazing, amazing collection from all over the world, old and new, from ancient to modern. You can see all the different countries, or some of them from Italy, from Germany, from Israel, from Iraq, from Russia. This is celebrating the miracle of the oil, one of the things that we talk about, and connecting to the Greek story and the Greek focus on olive oil. And really the miracles of Hanukkah were the miracle of the oil lasting for 8 days, and the miracle of the small army defeating the large army and resulting in freedom of religion and freedom of worship. So I'm going to end there because I want to leave some time for any questions or comments that people might have.
Okay, thank you, Elana. Do you want to take down? Yeah, you took down your slide. And first of all, thank you so much for connecting the dots through history and art and culture and architecture, and of course, religious struggles. It's fascinating how you weaved it all together. So thank you for doing that. And I don't know if anybody's got any questions. So it looks like, okay, first question, Dave, you have your hand up?
A comment. The part about how the Maccabees actually their strategy was very interesting, and this it was similarly used by Washington in the Revolutionary War, because England had the most powerful army and the most powerful navy in the world, and they lost to a bunch of ragtag non-soldiers.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Actually, I heard someone say about West Point, studying different things, and when I Googled it showed how all these I definitely George Washington, maybe Lincoln, also like different military rulers were really studying and focused on this idea of small kind of ragtag armies defeating these large powers. So it has its roots in far back in history.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments? No? Okay. Hey, I do have one question, Elana. Someone sent this note to me. How was I'm using the term paint. I don't know if that's the right term for all of those vessels. Was that paint, and how did they make their paint? Because obviously they lasted a really long time.
Right. Which is pretty amazing how long they lasted. So okay. So how did they have? So first of all, a lot of it is the original reddish color is the color of the terracotta. And then they had, I mean, it's a very involved process that we could spend a lot of time focusing on. But basically, they would they were potters, and they would mix the raw clay with water, and they would also use this wedging technique to prepare the clay. They often would use a wheel, and then they would decorate with liquid clay. And then they had a firing process. It was actually a three-stage firing process. And then depending on how they applied the clay, it would result in this distinctive either red or black color scheme. It's actually really interesting. It's a very involved process, which if you Google it, you can look on the Met actually has it's like a 5-page article on vase painting and the black figure versus red figure. So they did add paint to it, but it was a very involved process. But that's why from the St. Louis Art Museum, I put the two next to each other so you could kind
Right.
of see the difference. And it really depended, which if they how they applied the clay. The red color is the original color of the clay. And by the way, they were made and then they were fired in an oven at a very, very high temperature.
Okay, before we wrap up, I also wanted to thank you for touching on the ever evolving and ongoing debate about who owns what in different museums. I know that's a heartfelt passion for many, many people, and it's a very difficult, complicated situation. I mean, in many all over the world. So thank you for touching on that as well, because I think it's just, I don't know, it's pertinent and it's the right thing to do to acknowledge the struggle. So
Yeah.
thank you.
And it's ongoing. I mean, obviously
Yep,
we're talking about Greek and Roman, but in many, many different areas with African art. And I know from the
right.
Met, some objects are repatriated, some they're on loan or they come up, but their museums are working on it.
Yes, I know.
And it's a huge, huge topic of conversation.
Yeah, it's very complicated, and like I said,
It's very complicated.
there's a lot of passion involved in it. So
Yes. Yes.
okay, so we get together next month. We're going to be in the heart of winter, so it'll be perfect for winter at the Met. And we'll warm ourselves around the computer screens and say hello again. And I hope everybody makes it back. Okay, see
Thank
you,
you so
Elana.
much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elana.